we're going to have to change our schedule. I was invited on March 13th to testify before the U.S. House Committee on Foreign Relations to talk about this. So we won't have class on the 13th. But also you should know the person who's teaching your class is going to explain to the United States Congress what this means. So, see, your tuition is paying off for once. Good thing. What's that?
My tuition is paying you to be here.
Exactly, but now your letters of recommendation carry a lot more weight. And we'll record the lecture, it won't be any problem. Okay, so the South China Sea. What's that? Yeah, it'll be live, it'll be covered, I'll be on C-SPAN. So, yeah, this is kind of, I'm really gonna lose the weight. It's really time, and the camera is 20 pounds. I don't have 20 extra pounds. So, first I want to scroll back, and before we look at the South China Sea, I want to give you that map in your head so you can begin to conceptualize this. Yes, ma'am?
Wait, so you won't be here for the last day of class?
No, we're going to shift it, and I'm going to try to find an alternative day of class. Alternatively, we'll have the exam that day. We have the exam during regular exam week, but what I'll probably do is
Wait, why do we have the exam?
we have the exam regular exam week. Although some, at least one person's request to take it early, and that'll be taken care of, and Professor Henry or Professor Davis will probably be the one who will basically administer it. Or Professor Dresdova, because I'm teaching her classes the first week of the new quarter because she has to travel. So we have a little bargaining system. I'm owed the most because I teach way too many other people's classes. All right, let's scroll back and think about China's sense of security. And excuse my really horrible map here, but I'm trying to draw this freehand, and this takes a little bit of time. Really bad, I apologize. Sorry, it's really, really bad. It gives you the basics and so on and so forth. Okay, so it gives you the basics of it. Okay. Beijing. Now, if you look out from Beijing, what do you see? You see an enormous country that continually expands its powers, changing its institutions, is building its military, is trying to join the Arctic Council, and as we see, is trying to take over the South China Sea. If you're from Beijing and you look out, what do you see?
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of other countries.
Yep, there are lots of other countries.
You don't have a big backyard.
We have lots of other countries. There's Canada, there's Mexico, there's all of the Caribbean, there's Central America. What else it's not like we wake up in the morning and we're terrified of the Dominican Republic. I mean, what's going on? Look at it this way. Seoul, Tokyo, Okinawa, Taiwan, Philippines. What do you see? You look out from your territory and you see 26,500 American soldiers here. You see another 20 to 30,000 soldiers in Japan, another 10,000 in Okinawa. You see U.S. basing rights in Subic Bay and Clark Air Force Base, along with a former U.S. colony whose entire military was trained at West Point and at Fort Leavenworth. And you see Taiwan, which is colloquially referred to as China's unsinkable aircraft carrier, or the United States' unsinkable aircraft carrier. That's what Taiwan is, and a legally binding agreement that the U.S. will defend Taiwan at all costs. Let's move over to mainland Southeast Asia. What do you see down here? Vietnam, a country which might as well have the national motto, "We hate China." I mean, the relationship is that bad. It's 2,500 years of fighting against China for independence and so on and so forth. So the U.S. looks out, and we in the West make this huge mistake, because we look out and we see this globally expanding China. What China looks out and sees and says, we're completely boxed in. The United States after World War II, and this is just within Southeast Asia. Let's remember, you have Guam. I mean, yes, we can make fun of Guam, and they have the ugliest flag in the world, but Guam has an enormous military base. We have, here in Seattle, if you ever go to Tacoma, you drive by Joint Base Lewis McChord. What is Joint Base Lewis McChord's point? Why is it there? Washington State has a ton of military bases. I mean, a ton. I mean, you just drive around Seattle. Discovery Park, former military base. Magnuson Park, former military base. Joint Base Lewis McChord, current military base. What is its job? Why does it exist? The entire point of Joint Base Lewis McChord is, in the event of a war in mainland Asia, is to transfer as much of the U.S. military as possible to Asia. That's what its job is for. That's all it exists for. It's the transit point to ship the American Army and the American Marines across the Pacific to basically invade China or North Korea. That's what it's there for. China knows this, China sees this, and China is terrified. Wouldn't you be? I mean, this is, so for us, our perspective, and this is one of the most important lessons from this class on Southeast Asia, our perspective is always, ooh, China, it's expanding so much. China's perspective is, well, of course we're concerned. Have you seen the map? This is a problem.
I think it's the same thing that's happening with Russia and the NATO.
Yep, exactly. This is one of those aspects that's brought Russia and China together. Russia and China, in terms of strategic interest, have virtually nothing in common. They don't like each other. They have a minimum level of trust. But they share one common interest. And their common interest is ending this. And Russia thinks creating this, wrong. China thinks creating this. But they both share a desire to end that. This is classic great power politics. Now, if you're China, how do you resolve this? Well, you go down here to the South China Sea. If you can control the South China Sea, you can then resolve, again, at this little tip down here, sorry, Singapore, and the Straits of Malacca. Now, World War III happens. Let's assume it's not nuclear. Let's assume cooler heads prevail and we don't destroy the entire planet within 15 minutes. That would be nice. What do we ultimately see here? Well, the basic US strategy is really simple. Block. Simply blockade China and wait it out. China imports most of its oil, most of its minerals, most of its natural gas. If you can throw the 7th Fleet here, control the Straits of Malacca, and block all shipping out of that, you can starve out China. Literally. You can make sure that industry comes to a halt. You can basically make sure that they don't have fuel to basically fight the war any longer. You win. This is the official American military defense doctrine. This is how we go about figuring this stuff out. China's solution to resolve, sorry, Tinley?
I mean, I was gonna ask, like, how effectively can they hold that out, though? Because, China's very big. They can throw a lot of people at the blockade.
Exactly. The issue, of course, is to be able to throw people at the blockade, you have to have the fuel to basically supply your ships. And until 5 or 6 years ago, the US military, the US Navy was simply so large that you could lose, remember, the fleet that's allocated here is the 7th Fleet. There are 13 others. You can simply put one after another, after another, after another, and then call on Japan and apply NATO. I mean, the sheer size of it is enormous. China's initial solution was as follows. Be nice to Russia. Be friendly to Russia, be friendly to Southeast Asia. And what that means, ultimately, is instead of having to rely on shipping things, you can get your oil, your gas, your timber, your minerals from Kazakhstan, from Russia, and then you can survive. You can survive the American blockade. But of course, the Americans then also realized, well, obviously they're going to do that, so came up with ways to stop that occurring. So China's solution has been to fundamentally alter how the South China Sea is structured and how the South China Sea is bordered, based upon the famous nine-dash line. Write it down. It's referenced 8 different times. I counted in the documentary. The 9-dash line is essentially what China sees as its official legal border in the South China Sea. It says this is precisely how we go about observing. Okay. But the pens work anyway, why should we care? It basically says, China says this is our territory. This is the territory that goes back. And the claim, and it's 2 important things to know. One, the claim is not original from the People's Republic of China. It does not stem from 1949 after. This is a claim that goes quite far back. It was made under the previous government, the government of the Republic of China, the Kuomintang, which just had its elections, the people that run Taiwan. And technically Taiwan still has a claim to it, but Taiwan doesn't talk about it. Ultimately, what we see, Taiwan's claim, or what's called the Guomindang, or the nationalist claim, is called the 11-dash line. But the history of it goes back to the 14th century, it goes back to the Ming Dynasty, and it goes to my other favorite person in Chinese history, Zheng He. Zheng He was the admiral of the Chinese Navy. Why do we care about Zheng He? He's referenced a little bit in the book, not a ton, but why do we care about the guy?
And he sailed like extensively across the world.
Precisely, he sails through the Indian Ocean, he sails through the South China Sea, and so on and so forth. And to some degree, China does have something resembling a reasonable claim to this, even though it's not recognized by the international court. But if Zheng He and the Ming Navy were not, the Ming Dynasty basically are the most insular of China's dynasties. Why? So who's the dynasty before the Ming? After? Yep, you got it. There you go. The Yuan. Also, it's really helpful to, we know the Chinese dynasty song, yes? Or stop me in 3 minutes and we'll show the Chinese dynasty song, because you need to memorize the dynasties. It'll help you enormously. The prior dynasty, the Yuan, were essentially the Mongol dynasty. And the Mongols basically come in and control the Ming when they take over in the 1300s, in 1326. Basically say, okay, anything foreign is crap. Like, we've dealt with the foreigners, we've dealt with the Mongols, and so on and so forth. So in the 1300s, they allow their navy to continue until the Ming basically say, scrap it, close the military, close the navy, we're not doing that anymore. These are the folks that built the wall. I mean, the Great Wall, other people, the Jin had done it, other dynasties had done it, but it's these folks that build the Great Wall of China. And part of their whole thing is walling off the country. Now, why does this matter historically and counterfactually? Historically, this is before Prince Henry the Navigator in Portugal begin to learn basic navigation and go over and conquer large portions of Portugal in the Western Hemisphere. If the Ming Dynasty had chosen not to do this, world history would be fundamentally different. There would be no Western hegemony. There would be no Western revolution, industrial revolution. There would be no United States. China would today be the single dominant power in the world. This was probably, from a foreign affairs perspective, the worst possible solution and worst possible decision that you could ever possibly make. But it changes the course of world history entirely. And today we see things beginning to fundamentally alter. We begin to see this shift towards a new revisionist China, a new more powerful China, a new more powerful navy, and again, the 9-dash line and the goal of control over the South China Sea. So, looking at the question of the South China Sea and Southeast Asian engagement and so on and so forth, what are our initial thoughts from Rupert Wingfield Hayes? Tell me things. I'm going to turn on this video so we can memorize this, because you really need to know. I thought you guys knew the order of the dynasties, but if you don't, we'll run through it quickly at the end class. So what are our initial thoughts about Rupert Wingfield Hayes? We all watched the documentary. Yes.
I thought the part about the Spratly Islands and the Philippines basically paying colonists to live on the islands was really interesting.
Yep.
Yeah, it was just like an interesting approach to try to solve that problem and maintain their dominance over that land.
It's absolutely massive. China, so how is China, so what are China's main control and China's main area of territory is obviously it's the fight over the Spratly Islands. So the Spratly Islands in the east and center compared to, say, the Paracel Islands, which go against Vietnam. Spratly was primarily the focus upon this, where China's built an enormous amount of new military bases and so on and so forth. The main base, the main location that's a point of contestation is something we call Mischief Reef. It's quite fascinating to show the different approach. So China has built an entire community, an entire city, schools, etc. It's a functioning community. It has a post office. Anyone know what China? What does China do, or what does the Philippines do? How does the Philippines go about basically doing this? How does it exert its own claim to sovereignty?
Like you just said, they basically pay people to own this. Technically, it's a colony, and it's still Filipino territory.
They're mostly military, but
Right.
yeah.
So any kind of, I guess, intrusion by the Chinese would be like the Chinese being on Filipino soil, thus sparking the U.S. to come to their aid.
Absolutely. How do they build a military base?
They crashed they like just dropped an old World War II cruiser on a.
Yes, they crash a military cruiser into a coral reef and they put up a flag and say it's the Philippines now. I mean, you got to give the credit where it's due. I mean, as opposed to spending hundreds of billions of dollars, like, well, we have this old boat, we could crash it into the reef, put up the flag, we put 11 guys on it, we pay them money every year, we resupply them with food and so on and so forth, and everybody's okay. I mean, if you're talking about a cheap way to claim territory, it's actually pretty brilliant as a strategy and so on and so forth. So why do we care? Why do we find this so remarkably disconcerting? What is Wingfield Hayes' main conclusion? He's not because he's summarizing the expansion of the issue, but how do we go beyond that? His other points. So we'll finish off with a little bit of fun.
Well,
I know you guys want to do more Southeast Asia, so.
I think he's really showing how serious China is about the area. Like if
Got it.
like, he kind of made like a jest that like the Philippines crashed the ship here and they have 11 people on it, but that's not going to stop 8 destroyers from showing up and taking it if they want to. But
Yeah.
it is it's needed because the Philippines have a military alliance with the U.S.
Precisely.
And that's one of the main things that's like keeping this area kind of contained in a way. But China's still trying to exercise its power via dredging and all of these things.
Exactly. And this is the gigantic fear. The gigantic fear is, of course, the Philippines has a relationship with the United States. Of course, we see that Vietnam increasingly has a relationship with the United States. What happens when there is an actual shooting conflict or there is a Chinese military boat basically attacks a Philippine fisherman boat? What does that yield? Is it feasible that yields World War III? Yes. That's a shooting conflict between China and the United States. That's why, historically, we've considered the Taiwan Strait, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the class, as the key core element of problems, increasingly at South China Sea. How extreme did this become? A year ago, the government of the People's Republic of China said flights over the South China Sea and shipping through the South China Sea require our permission. The response by the government of the United States was to tell the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, totally pointless, ignore it, we'll take authority. And then to send, essentially, the American military the day after straight through the South China Sea. That's not friendly. That's a pretty strong statement of, we don't care what you have to say. This is a bottoming out of the relationship between the two. And no one's entirely certain how this is going to happen. Yes, sir?
Yeah, but there's an environment here in these projects that is changing over here.
Mm-hmm.
The Chinese government is not going anywhere.
No.
No matter what, 5 years, 7 years, they still got the plan. But if you check the Philippines, I think when it happened, the presidents over here, they changed.
Mhm.
So each president got their own.
And this is great. This is a great question. And this is what we're going to go into when we go into the Pei Min-shin book on China, because Pei Min-shin's book is arguing is that the corruption is so strong that we can't be certain we're going to see the identical China over a lengthy period of time. But we'll get to that in a moment. We'll continue on and we'll finish off as much as these. No extra reading because we're a little bit behind. I know you're so sad. And we'll go back and finish off this and finish off South China Sea. We'll start with the China, this chapter, and the Japan chapter, so we have the foreign policy down, then we'll go through the domestic stuff. I know it's a ton of material to cover because it is such a huge region. But you guys, about 6% of the class said more about Southeast Asia, so hopefully you're beginning to get a little bit of bigger picture on not just the history of the region, but the major security issues, and why this region of 650 million people is, in my view, the most important place on the planet, which I said it and therefore it's correct. Now, if you don't know the history of the People's Republic of China, and you don't know the history of China as a whole, I had to learn this when I was studying at Tsinghua University. Every single China scholar has to memorize it. Fair warning. It's painful. You will not get it out of your head for at least 2 days, but you will memorize the Chinese dynasty.